The rain had been falling for 6 hours over the row houses on Mercer Street in western Pennsylvania. It was the night of October 24th, 11 minutes after 11. A single sodium yellow bulb hung above a workbench in a converted garage at the back of the property. The bench was wiped clean except for one object. It was a Craftsman toolbox from the 1970s, brown enamel chipped down to dull steel at the corners. The latches had been snapped off. The seams between the lid and the body were welded shut in 4 ragged beads of cheap wire. The welds were sloppy, laid down by somebody in a hurry. The man standing over the box was not sloppy at all. He was 68 years old, grey at the temples, wearing a flannel shirt buttoned to the second from top button. His name was Henry Petrosky. He had paid $10.25 for this toolbox at 3:47 that afternoon, at Hollings & Son Auctioneers off Route 19. He bought it after the auctioneer made a joke about it that got the whole room laughing. The auctioneer had said somebody welded this one shut, which probably tells you everything you need to know about what is in there. He asked if anyone would give $5 to find out. Henry, who had not raised a paddle in 2 hours, raised his. He was now holding a 4.5-inch angle grinder. He had not yet plugged it in. There was a tabby cat asleep on a folded coat in the corner of the garage. Her name was Pepper, and she had belonged to his wife, who had died 8 months earlier in February. There was also, tucked into Henry's shirt pocket, a yellowing index card in his brother Danny's handwriting. He had read it so many times the creases had gone soft as cloth. He had come to that auction because of Danny. He bought the welded toolbox because the room laughed, and because the weld bead on the front seam had been laid by somebody in a hurry, and because something in Henry wanted to know what was worth welding shut and selling for $10. The part of him that had spent 41 years figuring out what people lock and why was asking that question. In the next 4 minutes he would cut the lid off this box. What he found inside it would, by Thanksgiving, put 2 men in handcuffs. It would return a dead man's life savings to a niece who did not know they existed. And it would answer a question his brother had been asking him in a letter mailed 5.5 years earlier, a letter Henry had never known how to answer. But to understand the welded toolbox on the workbench, you have to understand a phone call Henry got 3 weeks earlier from a number he had not seen since 2019. That phone call came on October 3rd at 20, after 8 in the morning. It was the kind of morning where Henry was already at the bench, because he no longer slept past 5. He had been a locksmith for 41 years. His shop was a narrow storefront on Mercer Street, with a hand-painted sign reading Petrosky Lock and Key, established 1983. He had closed it the week after his wife Marion died, in February, because he could not look at the front counter without seeing her standing there with 2 cups of coffee. The shop had been closed 8 months. He still went out to the garage workshop every morning, because the alternative was the kitchen, and the kitchen had her chair in it, empty. The number on the phone was a 412 area code he had not dialed since May of 2019, when his brother Danny died of a heart attack on the floor of the machine shop in Carnegie, where he had worked for 36 years. The voice on the other end was a woman named Carol, from Hollings & Son Auctioneers. She said they were clearing the estate of Danny's old shop foreman, and they had a box of tools they thought Henry might want to come look at, because Danny had told her years ago that his brother in Beaver County collected old lock sets. She asked if Henry wanted to come up on the 24th. Henry said yes, before he had finished thinking about it. He had not been back to that auction house in 20 years. Danny had loved it. He used to drive over every other Saturday from Carnegie and come home with cigar boxes of taps and dies, hand-rolled drill bits, micrometers in velvet-lined cases that he paid $4 for and refused to ever sell. Danny used to say Hollings & Son was where the real ones go, and the fakes go to the antique malls. He had said that in 1997, in 2008, in 2018. He had said it on the last index card he ever wrote, the 6th, one in a stack, in pencil, undated. On that 6th card, Danny had written that if anything ever happened to him, the boxes from Hollings were Henry's. He said Henry would know which ones. He said the ones the auctioneer pretends are junk are the ones to watch. Henry had read that card 1,000 times since 2019, and never understood it. He had assumed it was Danny being Danny, cryptic and half joking and half serious, the way he had been since they were boys. He had taken the cards, and one unexplained letter Danny had mailed him in February of 2019, 3 months before he died, and he had filed them away. He had opened that letter once, read it twice, and put it back in the drawer because it made no sense in 2019, and made less sense after. On October 3rd, after Carol hung up, Henry took the cards down off the shelf and read them in order for the first time in 5 years. He read the unexplained letter. He sat at the kitchen table with Pepper on his knee, and Marion's chair empty across from him, and he said out loud, to no one, that he did not know what Danny wanted him to see. But he was going to the auction on the 24th. Here is the thing about Henry Petrosky, that the people who laughed at the auction did not know. He had spent 41 years opening things other people had locked. 41 years looking at a deadbolt and a strike plate, and reading them like a sentence, figuring out who installed this, in what hurry, with what intent, hiding what. He had testified in 3 burglary cases over the years as an expert on tool marks. He knew the difference between a weld laid by a journeyman and a weld laid by a man who did not want to be doing it. He knew the difference between a box that had been welded shut to protect something and a box that had been welded shut to hide something. He decided 2 things that night, before he ever went to the auction. The first decision was that he would go, and he would look at every welded shut, painted over, taped up lot in the room, and he would not bid on any of them unless he saw something. The hand-eye of a man who has spent a career reading metal does not stop reading when he retires. The second decision, the one that would cost him something, was that he would not tell anyone he was going, and he would not tell anyone what he found. Henry was not a suspicious man by nature. He was a trusting man who had learned, late, that trust was a tool, and like every tool, it had a use and a misuse. Danny's last card had told him to watch the ones the auctioneer pretended were junk. Danny had been dead 5.5 years. If Danny had wanted Henry to watch, then Henry was going to watch quietly, alone, the way you watch a lock you are not sure has been picked, without announcing yourself, without giving the other side a chance to see you coming. He fed the cat. He laid out his canvas jacket. He put Danny's 6th index card in the breast pocket. He set his alarm for 4:30 on the morning of October 24th, even though the auction did not start until 10, because he wanted to drive there in the dark, the way Danny used to. This is where this story turns differently than you might expect. Henry did not, on the morning of October 24th, drive to Hollings & Son Auctioneers with a hidden camera in his lapel and a plan to spring a trap. He drove there with an old man's curiosity and an even older man's grief. The test Henry stages in this story does not begin in the parking lot. It begins after midnight, on the workbench, when he sees what is inside the welded toolbox and realizes, with the slow, cold clarity of a locksmith reading a strike plate, that the box was never meant to be sold to him. It was meant to be sold to someone in that room. And he is going to have to figure out who, without letting them know he knows. But the seeds of that staged counter-test are planted on the morning of the 24th, and they are worth listing now so they pay off later. Seed 1 was the steno notebook Henry brought. He always did, to auctions, because Danny had taught him to write down every lot number, every price, every face that bid on it. He filled 14 pages that day. He did not know yet that the notebook would become evidence. Seed 2 was a small magnet on a keyring, a habit from 40 years of identifying steel. He used it twice in the lock preview, once on a cast-iron doorstop that turned out to be zinc, and once on the welded toolbox. The toolbox was steel, heavy. Something in it had mass. Seed 3 was this. Henry looked at the 4 weld beads on the box, and saw what nobody else in the room saw. They were laid in the last week. The paint around them had been touched up with a brown spray enamel that did not quite match. He did not say a word. Seed 4 was the one that mattered most. Henry watched the auctioneer, a heavy-set man in his late 50s named Walt Hollings, work the room. And he watched a man in a faded Steelers jacket near the back. A man in his 40s with a shaved head and a paddle he never raised except on 3 specific lots. All 3 of them were welded, taped, or painted shut. He bought 2 of them. He bid hard, then stopped at exactly $12 on the third, which Henry, raising his paddle for the first time all day, bought for $10.25. The man in the stealer's jacket turned and looked at Henry. Not angry. Studying, the way a man looks at a lock he was not expecting. Henry paid in cash. He carried the toolbox to his truck. He drove the 41-mile home with the box on the passenger seat, and the rain starting around Cranberry, and he did not open it until 11 that night, because he wanted to be sure, before he picked up the grinder, that he was not making the kind of mistake an old man makes when he is lonely. The cat watched from the folded coat. The grinder was not yet plugged in. We are back where we started. Henry plugged the grinder in at 11:13. He cut the first weld bead in 11 seconds. The sparks hissed yellow against the brown enamel. Pepper the cat did not move. He cut the second bead in 9 seconds, the third in 10, and the fourth, the one along the front seam, the one laid worst, in 6. He set the grinder down. He let the metal cool for 2 full minutes by the clock on the wall, because hot steel and impatient hands are how locksmiths lose fingers, and Henry had 4 decades of habit telling him to wait. Then he took a flat-blade screwdriver and a rubber mallet, and he tapped the lid up at the 4 corners, in sequence, until it lifted free with a small puff of paint dust and the smell of oiled steel. What Henry saw inside the toolbox did not, at first, look like anything that would justify welding the box shut. He saw a top tray, the kind that lifts out, full of what at first glance was ordinary machinist's gear. 3 Sterret micrometers in their original blue cases, a set of Mitutoyo dial calipers, 2 brown and sharp indicators, a brown and sharp height gauge, a small bag of carbide inserts. Good tools. Maybe $600 worth of tools if you knew what they were, which most of the people at Hollings & Son that afternoon would not have. But not by themselves, the kind of thing you weld a box shut for. Then Henry lifted out the top tray, and the bottom compartment was where Danny's letter started to make sense. There were 2 envelopes wrapped in oilcloth. There was a small canvas drawstring bag, heavy. There was a leather wallet, men's, the kind that folds, worn through at one corner. There was a passbook from First Federal of Carnegie, bound shut with a rubber band that crumbled when Henry touched it. And underneath all of it, flat against the bottom of the box, there was a manila envelope, sealed, with a name written on it in pencil, in a hand that Henry knew the way you know your own. The name on the envelope said Earl. The handwriting was Danny's. Henry sat down on the workbench stool. He did not open the manila envelope. Not yet. He worked through the box the way he worked through everything, slowly, in order, writing as he went. The steno notebook came back out of his jacket. Page 15 began at 11:19 on October 24th. And the first entry read that the top tray held tools worth approximately $600 retail, with the initials EV scratched on the Sterret case. Ball-peened, old. The wallet had a Pennsylvania driver's license in it. The license had expired in 2019. The name on it was Earl R. Vance, born 1939, address on Sherrill Street in Carnegie. There was $83 in cash in the wallet, in old bills, 3 20s, 2 10s, 3 1s. There was a faded photograph of a woman in a sundress, undated, no name on the back. The passbook was from First Federal of Carnegie, a bank Henry knew had been swallowed by PNC sometime around 2007. The last entry was dated April 1981. The balance at that last entry was $14,287.42. The passbook had not been touched in 43 years. The canvas drawstring bag, when Henry untied it and tipped it out onto a clean rag on the bench, held 31 silver dollars, Morgans and Peace, mixed years, the oldest 1878, the newest 1928, and 4 small gold coins that Henry, who was not a coin man, did not yet know how to value. He would later be told by a numismatist in Pittsburgh that the gold coins were $20 Liberty double eagles, 3 of them in fine condition, one of them an 1856 S in very fine, and that the contents of the bag on the wholesale market was worth somewhere between $14,000 and $18,000. The two oilcloth-wrapped envelopes contained, between them, United States savings bonds, Series E, the old paper kind, in denominations of $100 and $500, made out to Earl R. Vance, issue dates running from 1962 to 1979. Henry counted 47 bonds. He would later be told they had matured to a redemption value of just over $31,000. And the manila envelope with Earl written on it in his brother's hand, Henry did not open that one. He set it aside, in the center of the bench, and he sat in the lamplight, in the smell of cut steel and rain. And he listened to the rain on the metal roof. For a long time he understood, sitting there, several things at once. He understood that this was Earl Vance's life. He understood that Earl Vance was dead, because nobody welds their own savings into a toolbox if they are alive to spend them. He understood that whoever welded this box shut had done it knowing what was inside. And he understood that the man in the Steeler's jacket at the back of the room that afternoon, the one who bid on every welded lot and stopped at $12 on this one, had not been there to buy junk. He had been there to buy this. And Henry Petrosky, accidentally, by raising a paddle for the first time all day, had bought it instead. Henry got up off the stool at 12:41 in the morning. He poured a glass of water. He did not drink it. He stood at the small window of the garage workshop and looked out at the rain on Mercer Street. And he ran what he knew through his mind the way a locksmith runs a pick through a cylinder, one pin at a time. The welds were a week old at most. The paint was fresh. Whoever welded the box had done it inside the auction house. Henry had seen in the lot preview that the box was already on the floor at 9 that morning, the welds dry but not weathered. The auctioneer, Walt Hollings, had cracked the joke about it on purpose. That joke had a job. The job of the joke was to depress the bidding, to make the room laugh at the box, so the bidding would top out under $20, so the man in the Steeler's jacket could buy it for $15, and walk out with $31,000 in matured bonds and $18,000 in silver and gold. It had only failed because Henry had raised his paddle. Henry took the steno notebook and wrote, on a fresh page, at 12:53, the name Walt Hollings. He wrote, Steeler's jacket man. He wrote salted lots and welded for camouflage. He wrote 2 questions, how many other welded boxes and how many other estates. And underneath that, the line that would decide everything. He wrote that they did not know he had this. He wrote that they thought the box was in the back of his truck. He wrote that they would be looking for him on Monday at the next auction to see if he brought it back, sold it, or talked. He wrote that he would go. He wrote that he would tell them he cut it open and found nothing but rusted tools. He wrote that he would let them watch him lie. He looked at the manila envelope on the bench, the one with Earl on it in Danny's hand, and he still did not open it. He put it in the top drawer of his bench and locked the drawer. He put the silver and gold and the bonds and the wallet and the passbook back in the toolbox, closed the lid as best he could over the cut seams, carried the box up the back stairs into the house, and put it under the bed in the spare room where Marion's sewing machine used to live. Then he went to bed. He did not sleep until almost 4. Pepper slept on Marion's pillow because she did not know any better. The next auction at Hollings & Son was on Wednesday, October 30th. Henry had 6 days to figure out exactly how to lie. On Friday, October 25th, Henry woke at 5 and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and unlocked the bench drawer and brought the manila envelope upstairs. He opened it at the kitchen table with a paring knife along the top seam, the way he had watched Marion open Christmas cards for 43 years. Inside the envelope were 3 things: a photograph, a handwritten letter from Danny to Earl Vance, dated February 12, 2019, and the second envelope, the one Danny had mailed Henry in February 2019, the unexplained letter Henry had read twice and never understood, which Danny had clearly meant Henry to read together with the letter to Earl. The photograph was black and white, glossy, the kind taken with a real camera in the 1970s. 2 men in coveralls, standing in front of a Bridgeport mill on a shop floor. Danny on the left, 22 years old, lean, grinning. The other man on the right, older, maybe 40, broad-shouldered, holding a coffee cup. The other man's coveralls had Earl stitched over the breast pocket. Henry turned the photograph over. On the back, in Danny's hand, it said Carnegie, 1980. Earl V. taught me to read a print. The letter from Danny to Earl, dated 2019, said this, and Henry read it aloud, alone in the kitchen, because there was nobody to read it to. Danny had written that he drove out to Sherrill Street last week, and the house was shut up. He said the neighbor told him Earl went into the home up by McMurray. He said he was sorry he did not come sooner. He said he wanted Earl to know he never forgot. He wrote that Earl told him in 1981 that if the mill ever went down for good, the only money that was real was the money you could put your hand on. Danny wrote that he thought about that every payday. He wrote that he was writing this so that if anything happened to him before he got back out to see Earl would know he tried. Underneath the letter to Earl, the envelope Danny had mailed Henry in February 2019. The unexplained letter. Henry had read it last in 2019 and not understood a word of it. He read it now and understood every word. Danny wrote that he was writing because Earl Vance was going into a nursing home, and Earl had asked him to be his executor, and he said yes before he thought it through. Danny wrote that Earl never married. He said Earl had one niece somewhere out by Erie he had not seen in 20 years. He wrote that Earl kept everything he owned in a Craftsman toolbox in his basement because he never trusted a bank after First Federal went under. Danny said Earl had bonds, coins, a passbook for a bank that did not exist anymore. He said Earl was 80 going on 81, and his mind was starting to slip. Danny wrote that he was going to keep the box at his shop for safekeeping. And then he wrote the lines that Henry had not been able to hear in 2019, but heard now like a bell. Danny wrote that if something happened to him, Hank should find the box and find the niece. He said her name was Rachel. He said he had not been able to track her down yet. And then he wrote the line that mattered. He wrote, "Do not trust the Hollings auction with this if I am not around to oversee it." He wrote that Walt III was not his father, and that he had heard things. Henry put the letter down on the kitchen table. He looked at Pepper, who was sitting on Marion's empty chair. He said it again, "You son of a bitch." Danny had died in May 2019, 3 months after writing that letter. The toolbox had stayed at Danny's shop for however long, and then Earl Vance had died in March 2024, in the nursing home in McMurray, alone, with no family at the bedside. Danny's old shop in Carnegie had been cleaned out by the landlord 6 months before, in April, the month after Earl died. The toolbox had ended up at Hollings & Son, the way half the contents of every closed shop in western Pennsylvania ended up at Hollings & Son. And somewhere along the way, somebody at Hollings had pried the box open, seen what was inside, welded it shut again, and put it on the auction floor for a Confederate to buy. Henry now knew 3 things he had not known the night before. He knew Earl Vance had been his brother's friend. He knew Danny had been trying to protect Earl when Danny died. And he knew, with a cold, practical certainty, that what was sitting under the bed in the spare room was not just stolen property. It was the last thing in the world his brother had asked him to do. He closed Danny's letter, folded it back into the manila envelope, and wrote on the front of the envelope, in pencil, in his own handwriting, 2 words, "Find Rachel." On Monday morning, October 28th, Henry sat at the workbench and wrote, in the steno notebook, the plan he was going to run. He wrote it in his own first person because there was no other voice he trusted with it. He wrote that he was going to the auction on Wednesday. He wrote that he was going to walk in with the empty toolbox in plain sight. He wrote that he was going to find Walt Hollings before the bidding started, and tell him he cut the box open Friday night, and found nothing in it but rusted hand tools and a passbook from a bank that did not exist anymore. He wrote that he was going to ask Walt if he wanted the box back, because the lid was ruined, and he had no use for it. He wrote that he was going to be a disappointed old man. He wrote that he was going to let Walt see his face. He wrote that if Walt flinched, he would know. He wrote that if Walt did not flinch, he would know something worse, that Walt had done this so many times that one more disappointed old man did not even register. He wrote that either way the man in the stealer's jacket would be in the room. He wrote that he wanted to see what the man did when he heard Henry say he found nothing. He underlined the last line. On Wednesday, October 30th, at 9:48 in the morning, Henry walked into the Hollings & Son auction house on Route 19 with the empty toolbox in both hands. He carried it like it was heavy, because empty toolboxes carried like they are heavy look full. He set it down on the registration table. The woman at the table, Carol, the same one who had called him 3 weeks ago, looked surprised to see him. She said he was back so soon. Henry said he wanted a word with Walt. He gestured at the toolbox and said it was about this. Walt Hollings came out of the back office in a tan blazer and a striped tie. He was 40 pounds heavier than he had been 20 years ago, and the weight sat badly on him. He shook Henry's hand. He looked at the toolbox. He smiled the auctioneer's smile that is no smile at all. He said that was the welded one. Henry said that was the welded one. Walt asked if he got it open. Henry said he got it open. Walt asked if anything was good, and this is the moment. Henry had practiced his face in the bathroom mirror for 2 days. He shrugged. He gave a small, embarrassed old man laugh. He said there were a couple of rusted-out wrenches. He said there was half a roll of friction tape. He said there was a bank passbook from a bank that did not exist anymore. He said there was $83 American in old bills, which he figured paid for the gas to get there last week. He said the lid was ruined. He said he wondered if Walt wanted the carcass back. Walt Hollings did not flinch. He did not even blink. He laughed, and he clapped Henry on the shoulder, and he said that he had told Henry that morning, and he had told the whole room. He said somebody welds a box shut for $10, because they do not want anybody to know how empty it is. He said to keep the carcass. He said to throw it in the scrap pile out back if he did not want it. He said to bid on something today, and he would knock 5 off whatever Henry won, for his trouble. He winked. He turned. He walked back to the office. Henry stood at the registration table for another 6 seconds, holding the empty box. In those 6 seconds, 2 things happened. The first thing was that Walt Hollings, halfway across the room, glanced quickly, instinctively, at the man in the Steelers jacket, who was leaning against a glass case full of pocket watches in the side gallery. The man in the Steelers jacket looked at Henry. He gave the smallest possible nod, half a shrug. Then he walked out the side door into the parking lot and did not come back for the auction. The second thing was that a woman Henry had not seen before, late 40s, blonde in a navy peacoat, with a clipboard emerged from the back office, conferred briefly with Walt at the doorway, and then disappeared again. Walt did not introduce her. Henry watched her go. He wrote down mentally that she was a woman in a peacoat with a clipboard, late 40s, and she knew Walt well. He would later learn her name was Linda Berris, and she was the appraiser of record for the estate of Earl R. Vance. Henry sat through the entire auction. He bid on nothing. He bought a cup of bad coffee for $1 and watched. There were 2 more welded-shut lots that day. Both of them were bought by a man Henry had never seen before, a thin man with a beard, for prices between $8 and $14. Henry drove home with the empty toolbox on the seat beside him, and a steno page that now had 6 new entries on it, including the description of the woman in the peacoat, and the question that would open the next door. Who certifies the inventory at Hollings & Son? Henry has lied to the auctioneer's face, and walked out with an empty toolbox. The man in the Steelers jacket has already left the room. Henry has no badge, no warrant, and no help. The question is, do you call the police now, or do you keep watching? I am going to tell you the rest of what Henry did in the second week of November, because the rest of what he did is what makes this story worth knowing. But before I do, I want you to do something. If you have been watching this old locksmith piece together a small thing into a large thing, and you want to see more of these, stories about the people who notice what other people walk past, then take a second and subscribe. Then come back. We are almost to the room on November 13th. On Thursday, October 31st, Henry drove to the Allegheny County Courthouse in Pittsburgh, parked 4 blocks away because his truck was too tall for the garage, and walked in the rain to the Orphans Court Records Office. He filled out a request slip for the estate file of Earl R. Vance, deceased March 14, 2024. He paid the $7 copy fee. He sat at a long oak table under a green-shaded lamp and read the file from cover to cover. It took him an hour and 40 minutes. The estate of Earl R. Vance had been opened on April 8, 2024, 3 weeks after his death at the McMurray Care Center. The executor of record was a man named Thomas Quill, an attorney in Carnegie, who had been named in Earl's 2011 will. The estate had been small, at least on paper. A paid-off row house on Sherrill Street, a 2002 Ford Ranger, the contents of a basement workshop, and a checking account with a balance of $1,847.13. Total estimated value, per the filed inventory, was $73,400, of which $69,000 was the row house. The inventory was signed by an appraiser of record. The appraiser's name was Linda Berris, certified personal property appraiser, license number listed, address listed, an office in Bridgeville, 2 miles from Hollings and Son. The inventory listed the contents of Earl's basement workshop as follows: assorted hand tools and machinist's instruments. Fair condition, estimated value, $400. $400 for Starrett micrometers, Mitutoyo calipers, Brown and Sharp indicators, a height gauge, and a toolbox that Henry now knew contained, in its lower compartment, approximately $49,000 in bonds, coins and gold. Earl Vance had named, in his will, one beneficiary: his niece, Rachel Vance Doyle of Erie, Pennsylvania. The address listed for her was on Pittsburgh Avenue. Henry wrote it in the steno book. He pulled, on a hunch, 3 other estate files from the previous 18 months, all of them flagged in the docket as having Hollings and Son as the auction house of record and Linda Berris as the appraiser. He read those too. The pattern was not subtle once you knew to look for it. Decedents with no immediate family, basement workshops or garages or attics inventoried at $300 to $700. Auction sales that returned to the estate between $400 and $900. Closed files. No heirs in a position to question what had not been listed. Henry sat back in the wooden chair. The orphan's court clerk, an older woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, asked him if he needed copies. He said yes. He paid $41.75 in copy fees and walked out into the rain with a manila folder of certified copies under his coat. In the truck, before he started the engine, he took out Danny's index card number 3, which he had been carrying in his wallet since Saturday. The card said that the appraisal is the lie, and everything else is just paperwork on top of the lie. Danny wrote that if you want to know who is stealing from an estate, you find out who appraised it. Danny had written that card sometime in the mid-2010s, when he was still alive, before he had any reason to suspect Hollings and Son of anything in particular. He had written it as general wisdom, the kind of thing a machinist who had watched too many old men get cleaned out by their own families used to mutter at the workbench. He had not known, when he wrote it, that he was leaving Henry an instruction manual. Henry drove home through the rain. He stopped at a payphone outside a Sheetz in Cranberry, because he did not want to use his cell, and he called Rachel Vance Doyle in Erie. A woman answered. Henry asked if she was Earl Vance's niece. There was a long pause. The woman said yes. Henry said his name was Henry Petrosky, and he was the brother of Danny Petrosky, who had worked with her uncle in 1980. And he had something of her uncle's he needed to give her, but he needed to ask her not to call anybody about it until he could explain in person. And could he drive up to Erie on Saturday? Rachel Vance Doyle, who was 38 years old and taught 4th grade and had not seen her uncle since she was 17, said yes. Henry drove home. He fed the cat. He wrote in the steno book, at 6:22 on October 31st, that there were 3 other estates with the same pattern and the same appraiser, and that this was not one box, it was a system. He wrote that he would drive to Erie Saturday, and after Erie, the Attorney General's office. Henry drove to Erie on Saturday, November 2nd, with the toolbox in a duffel bag on the floor of the passenger side, packed in a folded wool blanket, so it would not rattle. Rachel Vance Doyle met him in the parking lot of a Bob Evans off Interstate 90, because she did not want him coming to her house until she had seen his face. She was tall, dark-haired, wary, and she had brought a friend with her, a man in his 40s in a Carhartt jacket, who sat at the next booth and pretended to read a newspaper. Henry approved. He would have done the same. He laid it all out on the table over 2 cups of coffee. Danny, Earl, the 2019 letter, the auction, the welded box, the contents, the appraiser, the other 3 estates. Rachel listened without interrupting for almost 40 minutes. Her hands stayed flat on the table. When Henry was done, she said she had not heard her uncle's name out loud in 20 years. She did not cry. She did not thank him. She asked one question. She asked what he wanted her to do. Henry said he wanted her to do nothing until Wednesday. He said he wanted her not to call the lawyer. He said he wanted her not to call anybody. He said that on Wednesday morning he was going to the State Attorney General's office in Pittsburgh. He was going to give them the box, the inventory, the 4 estate files, his notes, and his brother's letters. He was going to ask them to put somebody in the room at the next Hollings auction on November 13th, which was the next welded lot day if their pattern held. He said if they were willing, he would be in that room too, and he would buy whatever welded lot Walt Hollings tried to dump, and they would see who came for it. He said after that, the box and what was in it was hers, and he would testify to every word of how it got to him. Rachel asked why he was doing this. Henry thought about it. He said because his brother asked him to, and because if he did not, the next old man who died alone in McMurray got cleaned out the same way, and the one after that, and the one after that. Rachel nodded once. She said Wednesday. On the drive home, somewhere outside Meadville, Henry made one more stop, a Tractor Supply with a payphone in the lot, which is becoming a theme of his week, and he called a friend in Pittsburgh named Ed Lazarus, a retired ATF agent he had done lock work for in the 90s. Ed had been telling him for 15 years to come to dinner. Henry asked Ed if he still had a friend at the State Attorney General's office. Ed said he had 2. Henry asked if Ed could call ahead for him on Monday. Ed said he would call tonight. The serial number on the toolbox itself was a small thing, but it mattered. On Sunday afternoon, November 3rd, Henry took a magnifying glass and a flashlight to the inside of the lid, in the corner under the lift-out tray, where craftsmen had stamped the production code in the 1970s. The code, partially obscured by paint, read 6550-3-11-78. The toolbox had been manufactured in November of 1978, sold at a Sears in Pittsburgh, almost certainly, to a machinist who had walked in with cash and walked out with the box. Earl Vance, that month, would have been 39 years old. He had been working at the Carnegie shop for 11 years. Danny Petrosky was 16 years old in November 1978, and would not start at that shop for another 2 years. The coincidence that was not a coincidence was this. Earl Vance had bought the toolbox new in 1978, with the wages of a year that no one in western Pennsylvania who lived through it ever forgot. The year the mills started to wobble. 3 years later, in 1981, the mills went down for real. The passbook in the box stopped getting deposits in April of 1981. The last bond was issued in 1979. Earl had stopped trusting paper money the year the steel industry died, and he had kept, for 43 years, every piece of his savings inside a toolbox in his basement, because he could not put his hand on a bank that would not fail him. Danny had known this. Danny had written it on index card number 5, which Henry now read again, sitting on the floor of the spare room with Pepper curled against his hip. Danny had written that the men who lived through 1981 do not trust banks. He wrote that they trust steel boxes. He wrote that if Henry ever inherited a box from one of them, he should check the bottom first. He wrote that the top tray is what they wanted you to see, and the bottom is what they were saving for somebody they loved. Danny had written that card knowing about Earl. He had written it as a key for Henry to find. Henry had carried it in his wallet for 5.5 years and not known what it was for. On Monday, November 4th, at 9:30 in the morning, Henry sat in a small conference room on the 7th floor of the Pennsylvania office of the Attorney General's Pittsburgh branch on Liberty Avenue, with a folder on the table in front of him and a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold. Across from him was a woman named Investigator Anna Reyes, 41, a former Allegheny County detective, in a dark suit and a thin gold cross necklace. Beside her was a younger man with a laptop, who took notes and said nothing. Henry walked them through it. He laid out the estate files. He laid out the contents of the box, photographed item by item, in the cold daylight of his garage on Sunday morning. He laid out the steno book, page by page, and translated his own handwriting where it had been written too fast. He played them, on his phone, the audio he had recorded at 36 minutes into the recording, where you could hear Walt Hollings say, "Keep the carcass," and laugh. Investigator Reyes listened without interrupting for 62 minutes. When Henry was done, she said 3 things in order. The first thing was that Mr. Petrosky had done in 2 weeks what they had been trying to get probable cause for in that office for a year and a half. She said they had 2 complaints filed against Hollings and Son in the last 14 months by heirs who came forward late. Neither had what Henry had. The second thing was that she needed him to not go back to that auction without them. The third thing was that if he was willing to be a confidential informant for the day of November 13th, and if he understood what that meant in terms of risk, and in terms of testimony, she thought they could build a case that closed this whole ring in one afternoon. Henry said yes. The bigger truth, laid out flat for the first time, was that Hollings and Son auctioneers had been running for at least 3 years a coordinated scheme to launder valuable contents out of small estates with no surviving immediate family. The mechanics were these. Walt Hollings, third-generation auctioneer, had inherited the business in 2012 and inherited debts along with it. A second mortgage on the auction house, a son in private rehab in Florida, an ex-wife with a judgment. Linda Beres, the appraiser, was certified, established, and respected. She had been Walt's mistress on and off since 2017, and she had been signing inventories for him for at least 4 years. The pattern was that when a small estate came through with no spouse, no children, and no executor who was paying close attention, Beres would inventory the personal property at a fraction of its real value. Hollings would arrange to take the contents on consignment. Items of clear value, coins, jewelry, bonds, watches, would be removed before the auction and sold privately. Items that were too distinctive to sell privately, or too risky to remove from the box they came in, would be welded or taped shut inside an unremarkable container, rotated onto the auction floor as a junk lot, and bought by a Confederate, Martin Cusack, a 44-year-old former forklift operator who had served 16 months for receiving stolen property in 2009 and was related to Linda Beres by marriage, for a price between $5 and $20. Cusack would carry the lot out of the building. The contents would be removed and converted to cash through a network of small dealers in Steubenville, Wheeling, and Youngstown. The empty containers were dumped. The take, Investigator Reyes estimated, was somewhere between $150,000 and $300,000 over 3 years. Small enough to stay below the federal radar. Large enough to keep 3 people in mortgages, rehab payments, and the bar tab at the steakhouse on Mount Lebanon that Walt frequented on Saturday nights. Earl Vance's box, with its full $49,000 in coins and bonds, was the largest single haul they had ever attempted to run. It was also the first one that had ever been bought, by accident, by an old locksmith who knew how to read a weld. This was stated here, once. It would not be re-summarized. Henry drove home from the Attorney General's office at 1 in the afternoon and stopped at the Sheets in Cranberry for gas and a chicken sandwich he did not eat. He sat in the parking lot with the engine off and the rain on the windshield, and he understood, for the first time, that the next 9 days were going to be the dangerous ones. Walt Hollings did not yet know that Henry knew. As far as Walt knew, Henry was an old man who had been disappointed by a welded box and gone home. But Walt was not a stupid man. He had been running the auction house for 12 years. He had spent that Wednesday after Henry left, looking, Henry was certain, at the registration ledger to see what Henry had paid for the box, at the security camera footage to see Henry's face at the lot preview, and at his own memory to see whether he had said anything to Henry that should not have been said. He had not. He would feel safe. He would feel safe for about 6 days, until Tuesday the 12th, when the Attorney General's office filed for the search warrant. Investigator Reyes had begun preparing on the afternoon of November 4th. But 6 days is a long time for a man who already feels watched. Walt Hollings had been watched for years by people who would never speak up. He had a sixth sense for it, and the moment he developed any suspicion that the welded box from October 24th had not contained rusted wrenches, he would do 3 things in quick succession. He would call Linda Berris. He would call Marty Cusack. And he would, within 12 hours, destroy every paper record in the back office, scrub the security cameras, and possibly leave the state on the pretext of a buying trip. If he did any of those things before Wednesday the 13th, the case died. The contents of the toolbox would be enough to return Earl's money to Rachel, eventually, after a long civil fight. But the ring, the other 3 estates, the dealers in Steubenville, the next old man who would die alone next month, the ring would scatter and reform under a different name. So the risk was not just to Henry. The risk was that 9 days from then, all of Henry's noticing came to nothing. The deadline was 10 a.m. on Wednesday, November 13th, when the next Hollings & Son auction began. The plan, as investigator Reyes built it out over the phone on Monday evening and Tuesday morning, had 4 moving parts. 1. Henry would walk into the auction on the 13th, carrying the same canvas jacket he had worn on the 24th, the same steno notebook, and a small button-style audio recorder concealed in the second button of his flannel shirt, lent and tested by the Attorney General's office. He would not be wearing a wire in the traditional sense. No transmitter, no live monitoring, because the office did not have the manpower to surveil the room in real time, and Henry's safety was not. Investigator Reyes was frank about this. The kind of safety a county-level sting routinely guaranteed. The recorder was for evidence after the fact. 2, Henry would identify, from the lot preview, the welded or taped lot most likely to be the salted. 1, he would not bid on it himself. He would let the bidding run normally and watch who bought it. 3, a second investigator, a man named Curtis Walsh, who would be present in the room posing as a clock collector, would, after the salted lot was bought and carried out, follow the buyer to the parking lot and observe the handoff if one occurred. Walsh was carrying a recorder of his own, and a phone with a hotline to 2 unmarked units parked 1 block south, on Route 19. 4, marked bills. The state had registered a sequence of 10 $100 bills that would be deposited, via a confidential informant working a separate file in Steubenville, the previous Friday, into the cash flow of the dealer network that fenced the Hollings rings, coins, and gold. If any of those bills surfaced in Walt's wallet, Marty's pocket, or the auction house cash box after the 13th, the federal money laundering angle opened up, and the case turned from a state-level theft prosecution into a multi-state case. On Friday, November 8th, 5 days before the auction, Henry came home from buying groceries to find that his back garage door, which he had latched on the way out, was standing 6 inches open. He stood in the driveway for a full minute before approaching it. Nothing was missing from the workshop. Nothing was disturbed. The empty toolbox, which was sitting on the workbench in plain sight because the contents were now in an evidence locker in Pittsburgh, had not been touched. But on the bench, next to the toolbox, was a single dirty rag that had not been there when Henry left, and the rag had a smear of brown spray enamel on it, the same shade as the touched-up paint on the toolbox. Somebody had been in his garage. Somebody had left him a message. Somebody, very calmly, had told Henry Petrosky that they knew where he lived. Henry called Investigator Reyes from the kitchen. She had a sheriff's deputy at his house in 11 minutes. He called Rachel Vance Doyle and told her, without naming it, that things had gotten serious, and that he was not going to bring her into the room on the 13th, and that the box was safe and would be hers regardless of what happened. She said to be careful, Mr. Petrosky. He said he would. He slept that Friday night with the kitchen light on and Pepper on the foot of the bed, and a 1968 Smith & Wesson Model 10, which had been Marion's father's, and which Henry had inherited and never carried, on the nightstand beside Danny's letters. On Saturday, November 9th, Investigator Reyes drove out to Henry's house, personally, in an unmarked car, with 2 evidence technicians who dusted the back garage door for prints and lifted 3 usable partials from the inside latch, Reyes told Henry. Sitting at his kitchen table over a pot of coffee, Henry kept refilling because his hands wanted something to do. That the partials would not be matched in time for Wednesday, and that the prints might never match anybody if the visitor had been Marty Cusack, whose prints from his 2009 case would in theory be on file, but in practice were of poor quality. She told Henry, gently, that he could pull out, that she could put a different informant in the room on Wednesday, that his evidence, the box, the records, the audio from the 30th, was enough to get a search warrant on the auction house regardless, and that with the warrant they would find, almost certainly, enough to convict Walt and Linda even without the sting. Henry thought about it for 14 seconds and said no. His reasons, which he did not say out loud, but which the steno notebook records on the page dated November 9th, were that if he did not go on Wednesday, Marty did not get caught in the act. And Marty was the one who walked, if he was not caught with the lot in his hand. Henry wrote that if Marty walked, then 6 months from now, when the auction house was closed and the trial was over, Marty would start up again somewhere else with a new auctioneer. He wrote that the whole point of the test was to catch the man who buys the lot, not just the man who sells it. He wrote that the whole point was that the lie at the cash table proves nothing, unless the lie at the cash table is followed by the buyer carrying the box out the door. The plan to spring it was, by Sunday the 10th, locked in. Henry would arrive at the auction on Wednesday at 9:45. The button recorder would be running from the moment he stepped out of his truck. He would walk in carrying his canvas jacket and the steno notebook, sit in the back row on the aisle side, and behave like a man who had come to bid on a small lot of vintage padlocks that Hollings and Son had advertised in the previous Friday's preview email. He would bid on the padlocks. He would lose the padlocks on purpose if the bidding went over $40. He would stay through the welded lot round. Investigator Walsh would be in the front, 2 rows back, with a bidder paddle of his own and a wristwatch that was actually a recorder. 2 unmarked units would be on Route 19. A third would be at the truck stop a mile north, ready to follow Marty's vehicle if Marty drove away with the lot. When Marty bought the welded lot, Reyes was nearly certain it would be a small steamer trunk that had appeared on the preview list at the last minute, locked with a hasp and padlock, listed as contents assorted household unsorted. Walsh would follow him to the parking lot. If Marty got into a vehicle alone, the units would tail him until he made a handoff or opened the lot, and the takedown would occur at that point. If Marty handed the lot directly to a second party in the parking lot, the takedown would occur at the parking lot. If at any point Marty appeared to recognize Walsh or Henry, the operation would be aborted. The room would be cleared on a phoned-in fire alarm, and the search warrant, already drafted and waiting on a judge's signature, would be executed on the auction house the following morning, regardless, Henry asked. One question at the briefing on Tuesday afternoon. He asked about Linda Berris. Reyes said Linda Berris would be in the back office on Wednesday. She would be arrested there at the moment Marty was taken in the parking lot, by 2 officers who would already be in the lobby waiting for the radio call. She said they had a probable cause arrest on her, based on the 4 estate inventories alone. Henry asked about Walt. Reyes said Walt would be in the auction booth. He would be the last one taken. He would be taken in the booth, in front of the room, because they wanted every regular bidder at Hollings and Son to see him taken. They wanted the room to know. Henry sat for a moment. He thought of his brother, who had loved that auction house, who had bought his first set of taps and dies there in 1981, who had written on the back of an index card that the ones the auctioneer pretends are junk are the ones to watch. He thought of Earl Vance, dead alone in a nursing home 8 months ago. He thought of Rachel, who had not heard her uncle's name out loud in 20 years. He said, "Wednesday it is." The auction on November 13th ran on schedule. Henry sat in the back row, on the aisle. He bid on the padlocks at 10:03, lost them at $42 to a heavy-set man in a Pittsburgh Penguins cap, and shook his head with a small smile, the way an old man smiles when he has been outbid by a younger man on something he did not really need. The welded lot was not, in the end, a steamer trunk. It was an old metal footlocker, military surplus, hasp and padlock, the seam between the lid and the body sealed with a thick line of clear silicone cork. Walt Hollings, in the booth, in a grey sport coat, smiled the auctioneer's smile and said into the microphone that this one was a mystery. He said the hasp was padlocked and the lid was corked. He said it could be anything in there, could be empty, could be Grandma's silver. He asked if anyone would give $10 to find out. The room laughed. The same laugh, the exact same texture as October 24th. The bidding opened at $10. It went to 11, to 12, to 14. A woman bid 16. Marty Cusack, in the third row from the back on the right side, raised his paddle for the first time all afternoon and bid 18. The woman dropped out. Marty got the footlocker for $18.50. He paid at the registration table at 1:26. He carried the footlocker out the side door into the parking lot. He set it in the bed of a red Chevrolet pickup, the same one Henry had noted in the lot on October 24th. License plate already photographed 3 times. Investigator Walsh went out the side door at 1:28, walking as if to his car. At 1:29 in the parking lot, a thin man with a beard, the same thin man Henry had seen buying welded lots on October 30th, pulled up beside Marty's truck in a white Ford Econoline. Marty handed him the footlocker. The thin man handed Marty an envelope. Marty got into the Chevy and started the engine. The radio call went out at 1:29 and 40 seconds. What happened next, in the auction room, was the moment Henry had been working towards since the night of October 24th. The double doors at the front of the lobby open. 2 state police officers in plain clothes come through. The room turns its head. They walk straight up the center aisle to the auction booth. Walt Hollings is in the middle of calling lot number 41. He stops mid-sentence. He looks at the officers. He looks at the room. The shorter officer says, quietly, "Mr. Hollings, we would like you to step down, sir." Walt sets the gavel down on the podium very carefully, the way you set down a thing you do not want to break. He steps down. The room is silent for the longest 3 seconds of Walt Hollings's life. In the back of the room, Henry Petrosky, flannel shirt, canvas jacket, steno notebook on his knee, does not move. He watches. The button on his shirt is still running. Pepper is at home on Marion's pillow. Rachel Vance Doyle is at her kitchen table in Erie, with the phone in her hand, waiting. In the side office, the door opens, and 2 more officers go in. Linda Berris, in the navy peacoat, is led out 50 seconds later. She does not look at the room. The room looks at her. In the parking lot, Marty Cusack is on the asphalt next to the red Chevrolet. The footlocker is in the bed of the truck where he put it. The thin man with the beard is in handcuffs by the white Econoline. The envelope Marty was handed 40 seconds earlier is in an evidence bag in Investigator Walsh's gloved hand. It contains $2,200 in cash. 3 of the marked $100 bills are in the envelope. Henry drove home at 3:45 that afternoon. The rain had stopped. The November sun was the color of weak tea. He drove the back way, through Coraopolis, and over the Sewickley Bridge, because he wanted to see the river. The river was high and brown. When he got home, Pepper was at the kitchen door. He let her up onto the table. Marion had never let her up on the table, Henry, since February, sometimes did. And he sat across from her with Danny's manila envelope, and his steno notebook, and the empty toolbox on the floor by his chair. He opened Danny's 2019 letter for the last time. He read the closing paragraphs aloud to the empty kitchen. Danny had written that he was sorry he never explained any of this in person. He said he thought he had more time. He said he always thought he had more time. He wrote that if Henry was reading this, then Earl was gone, and Danny was gone, and the box had come to Henry. He wrote that Henry would know what to do with it, because Danny had taught him what to do with everything else. He wrote, "Find the niece. Give her her uncle's life." He wrote, "Do not trust the easy answer about what is worth keeping and what is worth throwing out." He wrote that the auctioneer is wrong about the welded box, and the auctioneer is wrong about almost everything else too. That the ones they pretend are junk are the ones to watch. And then he wrote the line that closes the circle. He wrote that the whole world is welded shut about something, brother. He wrote that he and Henry were always the ones who cut them open. He wrote, "Take care of Marion. Take care of the cat." Henry sat at the table for a long time after he finished reading. Pepper put her chin on the corner of the envelope. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed and stopped and hummed again. He thought about Marion, who had been gone 9 months and 3 weeks, and who would have liked Rachel Vance Doyle, who taught 4th grade and had her hands flat on a coffee shop table when she said, "Be careful, Mr. Petrosky." He thought about Danny, who had been gone 5.5 years, and who had loved him enough to leave a key in a stack of index cards he never expected Henry to find in time. He thought about Earl Vance, who had trusted his whole life into a Craftsman toolbox in November of 1978, and had died 46 years later in a nursing home where nobody knew his name. Henry took the lid of the toolbox off the floor and set it on the table. He took the empty body of the toolbox and set it on the table beside the lid. He took Danny's letter, folded it carefully in thirds, and laid it inside the empty bottom compartment. He set the lid back on, the cut seams uneven, the brown enamel chipped. He left the toolbox on the kitchen table because there was no reason anymore to hide it. He fed the cat. He started a pot of soup. He called Rachel and told her it was done. Walt Hollings was arraigned on the morning of November 14th, on 12 counts, including theft by deception, conspiracy, and tampering with public records. He pleaded not guilty. By February of 2025, 3 months after his arrest, he had taken a plea agreement that gave him 4 years in state prison and full cooperation against the rest of the network. The auction house was closed. Linda Berris pleaded out 2 weeks before Walt did. Her appraiser's license was revoked permanently. She was sentenced to 18 months and ordered to pay restitution. The other 3 estates whose inventories she had signed were reopened and audited. 2 of them produced additional claims. Both of those claims were paid. Marty Cusack cooperated immediately in the back of the patrol car on November 13th. Before they had even closed the door, his testimony unwound the dealer network in Steubenville and Wheeling. He served 9 months. He did not return to Western Pennsylvania. The thin man with the beard turned out to be Marty's cousin. He did not cooperate. He served 2 years. Rachel Vance Doyle received, by certified release from the Attorney General's office in late January 2025, the contents of her Uncle Earl's toolbox: 31 silver dollars, 4 gold double eagles, 47 matured savings bonds, the wallet with the $83 in old bills, the passbook from First Federal of Carnegie, the photograph of the woman in the sundress, whose name Rachel did not know, but suspected from a family story might have been her uncle's older sister. The total redemption and appraised value, after restitution costs, came to $46,218. Rachel used part of it to pay off the mortgage on her own house. She used part of it to fund a small scholarship at the elementary school where she taught in her uncle's name. She drove down to Mercer Street in late February of 2025, in the first warm week of the year, with a tin of homemade ginger cookies on the passenger seat, and she sat at Henry's kitchen table for 2 hours, and she did not call him Mr. Petrosky once. She called him Henry. Before she left, she put a hand on the kitchen table, just for a second, the way someone places a hand on a stone in a churchyard. Henry watched her car go down Mercer Street. Pepper rubbed against his ankle. He went out to the garage and turned on the bench light and started organizing the lock-set drawers, because it was time, he thought, to reopen the shop. Petrosky Lock and Key, established 1983, reopened on the first Monday of March 2025, with a new coat of paint on the front door, Marion's color, which was a green that was almost blue, and a smaller sign hung underneath the old one that read, "Apprentice Wanted. Inquire within." Henry posted a notice at the trade school in Beaver Falls. He got 11 responses. He hired a young woman named Daphne Ortiz, 23, who had grown up in Aliquippa and had been working at the Sherwin-Williams on Brodhead Road since she was 19, and who had told him at the interview that she had taken apart the deadbolt on her own apartment door 6 times because she liked the way the wafers stacked. Henry hired her on the spot. He went back to the Hollings & Son building once, in April, when the county had cleared it for auction itself. He walked through the empty lot bays with his hands in his coat pockets. He did not buy anything. He stood for a moment in the corner of the side gallery, where Marty Cusack had leaned on the day of October 30th, and he did not feel triumph, or vindication, or even satisfaction. He felt the particular tiredness that comes after a thing that needed doing has been done. He started attending the smaller auctions in the county after that. There was a fair-sized one in Hopewell Township, an honest one, run by a man named Ed Tribble, who had worked under Walt Hollings's father in the 70s, and had hated Walt ever since. Henry went on Saturday mornings, with the steno notebook in his coat pocket, and he watched. He bid on small things. He bought a 1947 Russell padlock for $2 and a set of skeleton keys for $5. He did not buy any welded boxes. There were none to buy. Rachel came down twice more that spring, the second time with her husband and the dog. Henry made coffee. They sat on the back porch. The dog and Pepper achieved a wary truce. Rachel asked Henry, at one point, what he was going to do with all the money he had refused to take as a finder's fee. Henry said he had not refused a finder's fee. He had just not been offered one, because he had not asked for one, because the box had not been his to find a fee on. Rachel said she had offered him one. Henry said he did not remember it that way. Rachel laughed. The scholarship at her elementary school was named the Earl R. Vance Award for persistence. The first one was given in June 2025 to a fourth-grade boy who had taught himself to read against a learning difference, and could now, his teacher said, read aloud from the chapter book of his choice for 9 minutes without stopping. Daphne Ortiz turned out to be, Henry told his friend Ed Lazarus over coffee in May, the best apprentice he had ever had. She had her father's patience and her own ear, and she could hear the click of a pin set from across the workbench. He was going to teach her, he said, every single thing he knew. The final image of this story is not at the auction house, and not at the courthouse, and not at the elementary school in Erie. It is at the workbench in the back garage on Mercer Street. On a Sunday evening, in early March of 2025, the last cold rain of the season starting to fall on the metal roof. The Craftsman Toolbox sits on the workbench under the sodium yellow bulb where it sat on the night of October 24th. The lid is back on, the cut seams still visible, the brown enamel still chipped down to dull steel at the corners. Henry has welded the 4 seams shut again, neatly this time, with beads laid by a man who knew what he was doing. Beads that no one in any auction room would mistake for the work of a hurried hand. He is not selling it. He is not hiding it. He is putting it back together, because some things, once opened, deserve to be closed again on purpose, with care, the way you close a book you intend to keep. Inside the welded toolbox, in the bottom compartment, are 3 things and 3 things only. The first is Danny's last letter, the 2019 one, folded in thirds, in the manila envelope marked Earl in his brother's hand. The second is the photograph from 1980, the 2 men in coveralls in front of the Bridgeport Mill, Danny 22 and grinning, Earl 40, and holding a coffee cup. The third is a single Morgan silver dollar, dated 1878, which Rachel asked Henry to take, and which he did not refuse, because she was right that he had earned the right to keep. One thing, he runs his thumb along the front seam where the welds are new. He turns the bench light off. Pepper, on the folded coat in the corner, opens one eye and closes it again. The rain falls. The kitchen window upstairs is lit. The shop sign on Mercer Street has been turned to open for the first time in 13 months. Somewhere in Erie, a 4th-grade boy is reading aloud from a chapter book. Somewhere, in a state prison south of Pittsburgh, a man in a grey jumpsuit is 6 months into a 4-year sentence, and learning, perhaps, what the inside of a welded box feels like. Henry Petrosky, 68, locks the back garage door from the inside. He goes upstairs for supper.